Okay, in this video we're going to talk about creating a texture for your fish, and we're going to be making progressive textures where basically you're going to be building it so it generates itself. And just to start out kind of a little bit with the basics is you have your material output, and then you usually have a shader. I put in a mixed shader. To do that, of course, you just do Shift A, go to where it says shader, you can choose mix, and then to sort between the colors, you actually can do a texture of some sort. So if you do Shift A, there's different textures, of course, that you can do. So let's say, for instance, I go in here, let's select a wave texture. I'm going to set that there. And if I take the factor out and put it into my fish, here I have stripes, and I can use the scale. Smaller means larger, and higher means smaller. Okay. We can distort the scale. Okay, with this one, so you can play around with the waves. You can make it so it's more detail scale. If I zoom in here, you can see that a little bit better, or I could just take my scale and move it back down so I get a little bit larger here to the negatives there. So you can play around with, the main idea of this is just to try different things out with your fish to see what you like or don't like. So I'm going to cover a few different things here. One is that for my fish, I wanted it to not only be a little bit diffuse but also a little bit glossy. So I took both of these textures, and you could combine other textures together using the mixed texture. I could even slide this back and forth. One way, that's all the way towards the diffuse. And if I go this way, that's all the way towards the glossy. I have the roughness up right now. If I turn it all the way down, I get more of that kind of mirroring effect. And if I move it back downwards, it'll blend it. Roughness on the glossy will scatter the texture a little bit more. You could even do, let's do this, Shift A, I'm going to go to where it says shader, and I'm going to go to subsurface scattering. This will increase the processing that takes place, so you might want to be aware of that as we go. It's not actually where I want to put that. I wanted to get it moving, so I got to disconnect the little wires. Okay, from that side, thank you. And put that in there, there we go. Just again, before I do this, part of the setup here that I have is I'm taking the two shaders and I'm feeding the same color into both of those. And you can find the RGB color selector in you do Shift A input RGB, and that way you can still have two colors that you're going between for the two parts of this as you go. Excuse me. So I'm going to take this one and I'm going to bring it over to this shader here, and then I'm going to take the color and grab it and put it right into that. So that way I just kind of bypassed that for the moment. And it'll take a little bit to figure out what it's doing there. But if I move this down, subsurface scattering is nice for, again, taking light in and spreading it out through kind of underneath the surface so that the surface emits a little bit of light. It's fairly common for materials. It's kind of the way that they all work. Even like a wood desktop or whatever lets the light penetrate it a little bit, and it diffuses in the material itself. So you can play around with things like that, what materials you want to use. I'm going to disconnect that one, reconnect this one. If you don't have these going to an output, then they're not affecting anything. You could leave them attached, or you could unattach them, move it to someplace else where you want it. Just be careful as you're moving it. If you drag it over a line and it's highlighting it, it'll actually drop it into the process. And of course, this output is a little bit different because it's supposed to be a shader output, not a color output. There we go. So in playing around with this, I also was just messing around with the Voronoi texture here, and I put in this bump mapping section just to kind of bring that out a little bit. I'm going to go ahead and take this one here. I'm going to bring this down straight into the mix shader, and here I get this pattern, which kind of makes me think a little bit of fish scales and fish scaling. It's all good. And so I can work with that one like so. I could also, when I take this one away here, and I'm going to go ahead and put this one where it says normal into the factor. And I don't see much change there, and actually I didn't see much change between these things. But you can put other things to input. I actually, in this bump modifier here, I didn't actually notice much difference between strengths. One thing that I can do, though, is if I take this output and put it into displacement, you can see that I now have very much a bump texture going on with the fish where those darker lines are. As I change my scale, of course, that changes on the fish itself. Again, it's a matter of just playing around with what you like or don't like. Strength doesn't seem to really impact that very much. Distance didn't seem to really impact it either, other than it figures out re-rendering it. And in fact, if I take that out of the loop entirely, I do actually get a little bit different effect there. So, and actually that's because I skipped this one. Just a second. There we go. So there I have that there. If I take that factor and plug it into displacement as well, pretty much the same result as I had before. So not really necessary here, and maybe I'm not using that quite right. Maybe I want that to be between these two. So I take the normal, put it into here, and there I get a definite change. And so we could play around with those numbers, see what they do and what they generate. This really pattern's kind of interesting. But anyway, I'll play around with that later too, so that's might be something that I want to try. I also put in a mapping section here. So if I do Shift A and I go down to not input, I want to actually go down to things I just ran into this vector mapping. And then I imported UVs into this one, texture coordinates under Shift A, and I can find that under input. Typically, the input section, so texture coordinates down there, but typically the input ones don't have anything here on the left side, just the stuff coming on the outside because they serve as an input to modify other things. I'm going to take this vector and connect it there like so. Now I have back my pattern because now I have my texture mapping, and we can select different aspects here. So here I selected normal, vector, point, and texture. Texture changed a little bit. We could actually edit the way that the textures go around the fish. We'll do that in a later tutorial. Not with the fish specifically, but work with using some of those tools. And just be aware that you can adjust this so you don't get like the lines creasing like right there. and we can play around with that later too. So on this, now that I have a little bit more effect here with some of my settings there, I'm going to go back to where it said normal, because I kind of like that one. Maybe I can try that later. I have things like rotation here, so like I can see if that affects the way things are going. I can see some of those lines changing a little bit, and that affects both the bump and the other things, and I can again move it around to try and see what things look like. And of course my scale, if I move that up, I bring things closer together like so, and I just again take time to play around, try some of the different features